Good evening. Good evening. I'm Sandra Pierre, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and on behalf of our students, our faculty, and our staff, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our second event in the Jepson Leadership Forum this year, the series entitled Vision and Division. It's about leading in the course of divided times. This event is live streamed, and so I'd like to say hello to our alumni and supporters who are watching this evening. It's wonderful to have you online watching us. And I'd like to thank our faculty co-organizers of the series, Javier Hidalgo and Chris Van Ruden, who've, I think, put together a really wonderful series this year. It's my pleasure now to introduce Melissa Quiroga Herrera, who's going to introduce our speaker this evening. Melissa is the student, and she's going to introduce the speaker. Melissa is a senior at the University of Richmond. She double majors in leadership studies and healthcare studies, and she also has a minor in biology. At Richmond, she's a mentor for the Scholars Latino Initiative. She works as a tour guide in admissions. We always love to have Jepson students who are tour guides because it gets us lots of really good students in the school. She's a science leadership scholar, and she's interested in the biopolitics of healthcare and infectious diseases in Latin America. She would like to continue her studies with a master's degree in public health. Please welcome Melissa to the stage.
Thank you, Dean Pierre. Tonight, I am honored to introduce Ms. Rukmini Callimachi for tonight's Jepson Leadership Forum event. Ms. Callimachi is a distinguished foreign correspondent for the New York Times, where she covers Al-Qaeda and Islamic extremism. She's a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and was most recently nominated for her series of stories on internal Al-Qaeda documents she discovered in Mali. Prior to joining the Times, Ms. Callimachi spent 7 years covering a 20-country beat in Africa, first as a correspondent and later as West Africa Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. Along with many other accolades, Ms. Callimachi received the 2014 Michael Kelly Award and has won multiple overseas press club awards. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Ms. Rukmini Callimachi.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Melissa. That was a much too flattering introduction. Thank you, Jepson School. It's really an honor to be here. This is the city of Mosul in Iraq. And until a few months ago, it was a city of around 1 million people that was entirely under the control of a terrorist group. The military offensive to take back the city began in October of last year, so basically a year ago. It began under the Obama administration, and administration officials that I spoke to said that they were hopeful that they could clear the city of Mosul by January when Obama left office. I spent much of the last year in Mosul over 4 separate trips, including 2 months just this summer. And let's just say the city didn't fall in January. It took until July of this year, 7 months longer than had been predicted, before the city finally fell. It was in the western part of the city, which you are seeing here, that ISIS decided to make its last stand. My team was able to enter the worst hit neighborhood where the combat had been the fiercest on the afternoon actually, of July 9th, which was the same day that the city was declared liberated. We entered in armored cars, and let me tell you that I've covered conflict all over the world, I've covered earthquakes all over the world, and I have never seen destruction as bad as this. The American officials who were overseeing the fight were fond of making comparisons to World War II. I heard them describe Mosul as Dresden. Lieutenant General Townsend, who is the American commander of the war effort against ISIS, said it was, quote, the hardest combat I have witnessed in 35 years. When I entered the city, I shot a video on my iPhone through the window of the Humvee that was carrying me in. And I just wanted to show you, it's an amateur video, and I just wanted to show you what it looks like so that you have a sense of what it looks like. It was literally street after street, block after block that looked like that. In my opinion, it's a sign of our hubris that we thought we could defeat this group in essentially a third of the amount of time that it actually took. The fall of Mosul was a really big deal. On the day that it was liberated, July 9th, the Iraqi military pushed out to this little spot by the Tigris River. They took down ISIS's black flag, and they triumphantly planted the Iraqi flag. I think you can see how they're celebrating. And it was both an emotional and a joyful moment. Since then, the cities of Tal Afar and Hawija in Iraq, which were also under ISIS control, have fallen. And just this week, in fact yesterday, the city of Raqqa in Syria, which was the de facto capital of the Islamic State, has also been taken back. In all, ISIS has now lost around 90% of the territory that they controlled in Iraq and Syria. These are important gains, and I don't in any way wish to minimize them, but in my opinion, we are once again suffering from hubris. In recent weeks and months, we've been seeing headlines such as this: "The end of ISIS is near." Journalists and experts are conflating two things. They're conflating the territorial land holdings of this terrorist group with the terrorist group itself, and not understanding that the terrorist group came out of a place without land, and it is going to go back to a place without land, but that doesn't mean that it's gone away. If you retain one thing from my talk tonight, I hope it's this. Year after year, for more than a decade now, the Islamic State and its predecessor, Al-Qaeda, have been underestimated. They've been underestimated by the officials who are there fighting the fight. They've been underestimated by journalists and by the experts who are paid to study them. ISIS began taking and governing land in Iraq and Syria almost 4 years ago, in 2013, starting with little cities in Syria, then Raqqa, then they moved over in the next year to Iraq. 4 years. That's a really long time for a terrorist group to essentially have a home base. And I wanted to talk to you today about what will remain once every last inch of land that this group holds is finally gone. You see, ISIS knew that they were going to lose the Caliphate. They were facing almost daily airstrikes since the end of 2014. It wasn't a surprise that finally the coalition was going to come back and take this territory. They planned with that in mind. And in the 4 years that they held land and essentially had a home base and something of a haven, they developed both an innovative and a difficult to detect style of attack, which I think is now the future of this group. I like to call it the remote-controlled attack, and all it takes is an internet cable. ISIS operatives sitting in Syria, in Iraq, in Turkey, in Libya, in the Philippines, assume personas online. They use those identities to troll the internet and look for vulnerable young men, mentally ill young men, to carry out attacks in their home countries. And they guide them and they coax them to the violence. When it comes to terrorism, I think in the West we have a song that is stuck on replay. And especially in America, that song is the horrific events that happened on 9/11. The 9/11 attacks, which were designed by Osama bin Laden, were carried out by a commando of men that he had handpicked and trained, and they flew into the United States from overseas. They went to ground in our communities, and after some time, they rose back up, and they used planes, as we all know, to take down the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, etc. The model that our law enforcement was designed around to deal with terrorism was that model, namely of these guys who are over there coming over here. And the tripwire that law enforcement, the FBI, the CIA, and international partners were looking for was the tripwire of travel. Has this person come from there to here? Al-Qaeda was keenly aware of this. And around the year 2010, it could have been a little bit earlier, but I think the year 2010 is when this happened, they began to realize that they were having trouble carrying out attacks. 2006, the Madrid train bombings was the last major attack by Al-Qaeda at that period in time. And a guy called Abu Yunus al-Mauritani, a Mauritanian member of al-Qaeda who had become the head of their external operations, wrote a white paper. Literally a white paper is what they called it. It was a white paper that talked about the fact that they hadn't had any major attacks since 2006. And Abu Yunus al-Mauritani argued the following thing. He said to Osama bin Laden that the operations that they were putting together, these catastrophic, big, expensive, and catastrophic, again, attacks, were taking too long to both plan. They were being led by fighters who had been vetted by them and trained in detail by them. And so he suggested something else. He said, why don't we take a steer from what's happening right now in the Palestinian territories in and around Israel. At that point in time, there were stabbings that were happening in the West Bank. This is the resting place of an Israeli soldier who was stabbed to death by a Palestinian militant. He looked to those events, and he acknowledged that they were small, but he said, all we need to do is find a way to align ourselves with people who are doing these small little things, using a knife, maybe using a car, using very minor techniques, but in the end, causing terror in the communities that they are trying to terrorize. He suggested that what they needed to do is create a media platform, create propaganda, put out tools and ideas, and encourage people to essentially take on their message and say that they are doing it in the name of al-Qaeda. It was around then that al-Qaeda launched its magazine. It was called Inspire. The reason it was called Inspire was just that. They were trying to inspire attacks overseas by people they had never spoken to, by people they had never met, but who were going to be acting, they thought, in their name. Al-Qaeda had some success with this model of terrorism. The Boston Marathon bombings is perhaps the most acute example. The Boston Marathon bombers, if you'll recall, had put together pressure cooker bombs. And those pressure cooker bombs, the recipe for those was in this very magazine. There were a couple of others, but in general, what al-Qaeda managed to pull off pales in comparison to what ISIS did. ISIS took this model of terrorism, honed it, refined it, and took it to a new level. The ISIS plots that I'm going to share with you now were led by people that were typically described by our law enforcement as lone wolves. Lone wolves suggest that they were acting alone. But in fact, when you start peeling away the investigations, which usually take months, sometimes years, what you find is that many of these attackers were actually in touch with ISIS. They never traveled to Iraq and Syria. They never even spoke by phone. They never even heard the voice of the ISIS coaches who were helping them move into violence, but they were coached by ISIS nonetheless. And in the most sophisticated plots, I'm going to share at least two of those with you now, it was as if ISIS was holding a remote control, and from far away, typically from Syria, was remote controlling these attacks. That's why this style of attack is being called a remote-controlled attack. It was in 2015 that I first heard that term used by an official, remote-controlled attack, except I didn't hear it in English. I heard it in French. French officials call these attacks télécommandés, literally remote-controlled. I'm going to take you to France, to a suburb of Paris. It's called Villejuif. And it was here on April 19th, 2015, that a 23-year-old man named Sid Ahmed Glam tried to open fire on a church during Mass. I'm going to call him example 1, Sid Ahmed Glam in Villejuif, France. This is what he looked like. Here's what's curious. This guy, who was intending to essentially open fire on a church, was such a bad shot that before he'd even gotten to the church, he managed to shoot himself in the leg. He was bleeding, and in a moment of what I can only describe as true stupidity, he then proceeded to call 911. When the ambulance arrived, arrived. In France, it's very difficult to get weapons. So when the ambulance arrived, he initially tried to say that somebody had shot him, but then he couldn't explain who the person was, and that story fell apart. Then he told the emergency responders that he was walking on the street, he saw a bag, he decided to open it, he found a gun, the gun went off, he shot himself. Where's the bag? He says he threw it in the River Seine. So anyway, his story was not fitting together, and the emergency responders and the doctors called police. Police tried to interview him. That didn't go very well. They went to the spot where he had been picked up, and they literally followed the traces of blood that he had left on the ground, and those traces of blood led them to a car. And in the car, they found a stash of weapons, which had his fingerprints on them, and realized that something more important was going on. So let me ask you, at first blush, does this guy strike you as a professional killer, a hardened terrorist, an operative of the Islamic State? Okay, or does he look more like an amateur, right? I mean, he shot himself in the leg. Okay. Let me tell you how this incident played out in the French press. He was described as basically being a screw-up, a young man who was adrift, an amateur, mentally unwell, a lone wolf. We'll hear this term again and again in the description of these attacks. The case got almost no press internationally. Am I right in assuming that most of you have never heard of Sid Ahmed Ghulam? Right. Let me tell you what else they found in his car. They found this, his Lenovo laptop. And on his laptop, they found a series of chats between Sid Ahmed Ghulam and a handler for the Islamic State. If you read the chats, what's stunning is not just that they're inspiring him to carry out acts of violence. We expect this from ISIS. They put this out in their propaganda all the time. What is surprising is that the operative who was in Syria didn't just inspire this guy to carry out violence. The handler also managed to arrange for the weapons he was going to be used to be dropped off in Paris. Now remember, France is a little different from here back home. It's much more difficult to buy weapons in France. In general, you need to have some sort of link to the criminal underworld in order to be able to buy the weapons. So what the ISIS handler based in Syria, who was a French national, what he did is he contacted this criminal underworld and he arranged for the drop to happen and then told Sid Ahmed Ghulam where to go to pick it up. I know this because I was able to get the classified investigation file into the Sid Ahmed Ghulam case. This is the document from the Criminal Brigade in Paris. And here on the second page of it, they detail the chats that they found inside his Lenovo laptop. I'm going to read it for you because I just find it so telling. It begins, "O Aki," which means, Aki is the Arabic word for brother. Here's my translation. "Okay, brother," this is the handler, the ISIS guy, the ISIS handler speaking to Sid. "Okay, brother, now pay attention. You're going to find on that road a sandwich shop at the corner called Atmosphere. Once you've found the sandwich shop, cross the main street and continue straight ahead, where you'll find a complex. Go inside and you'll find an area where they park cars. Look among the cars that are parked there near the big road and look for a Renault Megane. Once you've found the car, go look at the front right tire and you'll find the keys placed on top. Open it and retrieve the bag." In the bag, as you can imagine, were the automatic weapons that he was supposed to use in the church attack. Do you see how incredible this is? Somebody in Syria is arranging this. Somebody in Syria is arranging for weapons to be left in the backseat of a car in a parking garage in Paris with the keys left on the front right tire, right? The CCTV footage that the investigators later collected showed that indeed this is where Sid Ahmed Ghulam went to pick up this car. And even though this attack was not successful, it showed pretty early on, so we're talking the spring of 2015, less than a year into ISIS's Caliphate, just what kind of reach they had into European countries. I'm going to give you an example now that's closer to home. Example number 2. This is Emmanuel Litchman. And this incident happened in Rochester, New York. This is Emmanuel Litchman. He was 25 years old in 2015 and living, as I said, in Rochester. when he started communicating online with an ISIS operative who went by the nom de guerre, Abu Issa al-Amriki. I wish I could show you a photo of this man. This man was killed in a drone strike last year. To this day, we do not have, or at least I don't have, any sort of visual on what this man looked like. He took the name al-Amriki, which in Arabic means the American. Typically, foreign fighters that join the Islamic State take a tagline like this that identifies either where they're from or where their heritage is from. And so it's a reasonable guess to think that this guy might be American. But in fact, even his nationality is not known. When he was killed, the Pentagon initially said that they believed that he was a Sudanese national. Later on, when I spoke to investigators overseas, they said no, they believe he's American. So even his citizenship is unknown. On December 25th, 2015, so Christmas Day, Emmanuel Litchman gets in touch with Abu Issa al-Amriki using social media. Emmanuel Litchman tells him that he's really interested in going to Syria, and they start chatting. Here's a part of the criminal complaint against Emmanuel Litchman. Litchman asks Abu Issa al-Amriki, what's it like over there? And Abu Issa al-Amriki says to him, it's a dream come true. That's the point when Emmanuel Litchman starts to ask him for help. How can I get over there? I'd like to go join the Caliphate. But the ISIS handler tells him very quickly that the border is closed, it's become too dangerous to come over, and very quickly he reorients the young man and tells him that in fact his duty is to attack back home in America. This is a pattern that we're seeing with these attacks. So back in 2012, 2013, 2014, and part of 2015, the message that ISIS was pushing out to Muslims and to converts to their cause was, it is your duty to come and join the Caliphate. You must come. This is a religious duty. They then pivoted once it became very dangerous to go there and the airstrikes started. They pivoted and they started to tell people, don't come. Your duty now is to attack back home. So Emmanuel Litchman keeps on saying, but I'd like to come, and Abu Issa al-Amriki at this point tells him, you know what, in order to get to Syria and enter the Caliphate, you need to have somebody who vets you. You basically need to have a reference, and you don't have a reference. And he says to him, I'm willing to act as your reference if you do something to, quote, prove yourself. How's he going to prove himself? That's when Abu Issa al-Amriki starts talking to him about a very specific type of attack. He says to him that he wants him to attack a location in his hometown on New Year's Eve 2015. So keep in mind, this chat that's happening here was happening on December 25th and 26th. So he wants this man to attack something within a week, right? So not a lot of time here. The next step, he tells him, is that he has to pledge allegiance to the terrorist group. This is, again, a pattern that we're seeing where they pledge allegiance either in a document, in a video, and this surfaces after the attack and acts as a way for ISIS to prove that the person was acting in their name. They then decide to choose a target. The target that they choose is a bar called Merchant's Grill. And notice the date of this conversation. We're now at December 28th. So basically 4 days after they started talking, they've already chosen the place. Over the next few days, the recruiter was constantly online with this young man. He was watching over every step of the preparation, including a trip to Walmart, where he went to buy masks, gloves, zip ties, duct tape, and a knife. His plan was apparently to go into Merchant's Grill bar and take some people hostage and decapitate them on camera, and then use a video camera to show that to the world. The Walmart trip happens on December 29th, so we're now like 5 days after they started talking. Thank God, Litchman was arrested just hours before he was going to go ahead and do this attack. And the reason law enforcement was able to foil this plot is because at one point, Abu Issa al-Amriki, the ISIS recruiter, introduced the young man in Rochester to another accomplice who he said was a trusted brother. He wanted the two men to carry out this attack together. Little did he know that the man he was introducing him to was actually an FBI informant. So the ISIS handler, I have to give props to the FBI here. The FBI managed to make one of ISIS's most famous recruiters and handlers believe that he was a member of ISIS. The informant went with Litchman to Walmart, to all these places, and saw all of these things unfolding. And then right before the attack, the arrest was made, and the plot, thank God, was busted. Again, do you see what I mean about remote control terrorism? Yeah? This is the last example that I'll have time to talk about tonight, and it happens in India. I'm going to call it the Hyderabad Plot. At the same time that Abu Isa al-Amriki was watching over this young man in Rochester and coordinating his trips to Walmart, the same recruiter, Abu Isa al-Amriki, was also speaking to a young man in India who was interested in joining the Caliphate. And much like in Rochester, the same set of events unfolded. The young man in India tried to come to Syria. He kept on being foiled because he couldn't get a visa to Turkey. And finally, frustrated, he turned to Abu Isa al-Amriki, and Abu Isa al-Amriki gave him basically the same line that he gave to the man in Rochester, and he said that you would be much more useful if you did an attack in India. The young man in India was named Ibrahim Yazdani. Hyderabad is, interestingly, it's one of the tech hubs of India, so it's not a place where you would expect this to happen. It's a pretty affluent place. This is Ibrahim Yazdani there in the blue shirt, and his younger brother who he recruited into the plot. As soon as it became clear that this young man and the men around him were willing to carry out violence, Abu Isa al-Amriki handed him off to another ISIS handler. That one spoke Hindi. So this points to how complicated and, in a way, sophisticated this group inside of ISIS had become. Not only did they have English speakers who were dealing with things in America, not only did they have French speakers who knew France so intimately that they could literally position a key on a car in a parking garage in Paris, but they also had Hindi speakers from India, at least one, who had become one of their handlers, and this Hindi speaker took over the plot roughly in the spring of last year. The first thing that they did again is the ISIS handler taught these men how to pledge allegiance to ISIS. They had to write a very formal pledge. He then introduced them to about a half a dozen encrypted messaging apps. They wanted them to use only encrypted apps when they were speaking. The men pledged allegiance and used this encrypted app to send the pledge back. And then they were by May of last year, they were in full-fledged planning mode. And just like in France, in India, it's difficult to get guns. So the ISIS handler, the Hindi-speaking ISIS handler, proceeded to put in place a plan and a series of events that led them to once again pick up weapons. It was in May of last year that Ibrahim Yazdani got an encrypted message from the handler telling him that he needed to go to the city of Nanded. The city of Nanded is about 200 miles away from Hyderabad, and that he needed to arrive there the next morning. These guys didn't have so much as a car, so they went to a friend's house and borrowed a motorcycle. They drove all night in order to reach the location the next day. At dawn the next morning, they sent another encrypted message to the handler. The handler told them to go to the airport in Nanded, and he told them to look for something called the DRM office, some sort of railroad office. He said, across the street from that office, you were to look for a tree. By the way, I'm not kidding here. They left the guns in the tree, okay? I wanted to read you just an excerpt from the interrogation record of one of the men who was in this plot, who ended up turning over on his fellow jihadists when he was arrested. And I wanted you to remark on both how, I would say, insane and almost absurd it is that these men that are thousands of miles away in Syria are able to organize this. At the 8:30 hour, we reached the spot. And since there was no one, we sat for some time on the pavement, I'd say for 5 to 10 minutes. It was informed by the handler that opposite the DRM office, there are 2 trees. And on one of the trees, there would be a white color polythene sheet hanging around 20 feet. Beyond there is the airport wall, and the consignment, he said, is going to be kept in the bushes along the airport wall. The interrogation record at this point made me laugh because they then explained how they were worried that they might be watched, by somebody in the area. Maybe they were being tracked by police. And so he obviously thought he was being very crafty when he said, quote, "We spotted the place, and I, first on the pretext of urinating, went to check for the consignment." They found the bag, and inside of it was a pistol and some ammunition. The case is much more involved than I have time to get into, but let's just say that particular handgun that they were given malfunctioned. And over the next several weeks, the handler in Syria sent them to around 6 other locations. They were sent to the north of India, almost an overnight train journey away, to a railroad station where they found another weapons drop that had been left under a railroad tie. They were sent to a freeway flyover, and underneath the freeway flyover, they found a bag that contained the ingredients that they needed to make the explosive. This case was busted when the members of the cell broke with protocol, the protocol that ISIS had given them, and started discussing their plans on the phone using code words. Again, I laughed because the code that they were using to describe the fact that they were preparing a bomb was, "We are, quote, cooking the rice." We're meeting to cook the rice. Police had been watching them. Incidentally, I went to the house of the main ringleader of the cell. They lived very close to a mosque in the most conservative Muslim neighborhood in Hyderabad, where the women are completely covered, including their faces. When I went into his house, we never saw their female relatives. The women are just completely sequestered. And so when I spoke to the police, they explained to me that they knew where these people were coming from. They had already been tracking them because they knew that one of the men of this group was a suspected extremist. And they knew that in this particular neighborhood, the separation of the sexes is absolute. So the thought that a bunch of men were busy cooking rice, set off alarm bells. There have been dozens of these types of plots showing different levels of direction from ISIS. And just like the Hyderabad plot and the other 2 that I described to you, many of them failed. And thankfully they failed because one of the limitations of this style of attack is that the people carrying it out are indeed amateurs. They're people who are learning online how to make an explosive, how to use a weapon, and the various arts that ISIS is trying to teach them, and they make rookie errors as a result. That said, there have also been several deadly attacks, awful ones, that were remote controlled in this way. Among them, the beheading of a French priest during Mass in the summer of 2016 in this beautiful church in Normandy in France. The people who did it were 2 French men, and when their phones were recovered, we found the Telegram chats. Telegram is an app, an encrypted app that people use to communicate, and that is quite popular with ISIS. And they had been communicating with a French member of ISIS who was walking them through the steps. You might remember last Christmas in Berlin, a man called Anas Amri used this truck to ram into shoppers at a Christmas market. This was one of the first cases where the communications were not going back and forth to Syria. They were instead going back and forth with ISIS in Libya. And that's an interesting development that we're seeing now, which is that as the territorial caliphate in Iraq and Syria is shrinking, these assets are being redeployed to other parts of the world. So how do these ISIS handlers make contact with potential attackers? They use the internet, right? All they need is a Wi-Fi signal and a smartphone. They can do this from literally anywhere in the world. This is not something that is dependent on having land, on being in Iraq or Syria. And as I've pointed out, Libya seems to be becoming one of the next hubs. There is some indication that the bomber who attacked the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester earlier this year was also possibly in communication with ISIS members in Libya. And just a few months ago, A bomb plot was thwarted in Australia. It involved a bomb that was packed into a suitcase that the attacker was trying to bring onto the plane. And the investigation revealed that the components of that bomb had been shipped by an ISIS member who was shipping them from Turkey. Turkey has also become one of the places where they have moved to. Last year, in a story that I reported with a colleague, I was actually told by officials that several hundred ISIS operatives had moved into the European Union, and several hundred more were now in Turkey. This was in 2016. Let me end with this thought. When ISIS declared its caliphate in 2014, it went on to grab territory that spanned the size of the United Kingdom, not just in Iraq and Syria, but also in Libya, in parts of the Philippines, in West Africa, in Egypt, in the Sinai, etc. They then created an administrative subdivision. They created what they called wilayats. Wilayat is the Arabic word for province. And they declared around 24 wilayats all over the world. Wilayat Nineveh, which is Nineveh province, that's where Mosul was. Wilayat Al Jazeera is the north of Iraq, etc. For as long as I've been covering ISIS supporters and members that I have spoken to have spoken in whispers about what they call Wilayat Internet, their province on the internet. ISIS and their followers are on virtually every social media platform that you can imagine, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Tumblr, on Snapchat, on YouTube. They're using every encrypted messaging app that is on the market, from WhatsApp to Threema to Kik to SureSpot to Signal to Telegram. That's why I caution people when they hastily, and in my opinion, arrogantly, announce the end of ISIS. We're very far from that, in my opinion, and even if we take back every one of their territorial wilayats or provinces and every inch of the ground that they have conquered, we will still be left with wilayat internet. I will end with this image. This is an image that was put out by ISIS. It's, of course, the Twitter logo that is dressed in black, in the ISIS flag. ISIS has long known that the internet is one of its most powerful tools. It's digital caliphate, as they call it, and I don't yet see how we are going to be able to take back that particular caliphate. Thank you so much for your time. I've been told that there's a microphone at this end, and if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Very informative.
Thank you. Good evening.
Scary stuff. What is it that ISIS wants to accomplish?
I think that we should take them at their word, and they have been very clear on what they want. They want to establish a caliphate, which is an Islamic territory that, in their view, is governed by Sharia law. They want every Christian on the globe to convert to their particular faith. They want every Shia Muslim to convert to Sunni Islam. And they plan to do this with violence.
Thank you very much.
Hi, sir.
It was
Thank you.
very informative, as this gentleman said. Knowing that you see it and understand it clearly as an internet experience,
Yeah.
I have two questions. How do you feel about the liberties that the internet affords us? And would you consider a form of censorship of the internet in order to protect us?
Sure. So social media platforms were, in my opinion, quite late to come to this problem. I believe in April of 2015, a scholar named J.M. Berger did a study of how many ISIS accounts were just on Twitter. And he said that his data was conservative, and he estimated in April of 2015, so less than a year into ISIS's caliphate, that just on Twitter, the group had between 40 and 70,000 Twitter accounts, right? Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc., they have since then, little by little, and including after some lawsuits, they've been sued by the families of the San Bernardino victims, by the families of the Paris victims, by the families of the Orlando victims. They have now started to be more aggressive in shutting down these accounts, and at least on Twitter, I feel like I'm starting to see an effect. ISIS accounts are still there, but they don't stay up very long. So ISIS is forced to regenerate the accounts. It's a long-standing conversation, you know, because what of course makes our society unique is the freedoms that we have. And one of the freedoms that we have is our expression on these social media platforms. Michael Smith, who is one expert that studies ISIS, has been very hawkish in the direction of advocating for specific controls on these social media engines. The proposal he's put forward is right now, what ISIS does is they tell their supporters to use a VPN. By using a VPN, you cannot see the IP address where the particular account is posting from. And as a result, they can hide. They can literally hide and be behind a wall of anonymity. What's interesting is when I travel to Iraq, and I've gone 4 times just in the last year, I've spent months there. When I go to my hotel room and I'm really tired after a day in that scenery that I've showed you there, and I go and I click on Netflix because I want to go see Modern Family, my favorite show, I get a little pop-up bubble that says, we're very sorry, there's no international plan and you cannot log in from overseas. So thinking that I'm being very crafty, I go and put in a VPN. I'm going to be like ISIS. I'm going to put in a VPN. They won't know. I'll say that I'm in California, right? I try to put in a VPN, and I get a second error message from Netflix saying, we're very sorry. Netflix does not support they called it an anonymized service, such as the one that you are using. Please remove this to log back into Netflix. So American companies like Netflix, for commercial reasons, have already banned the use of VPNs, right? Social media companies have not. And the argument that they make is that one of the reasons that people want to be anonymous and want to use VPNs is if you're in a place like Cairo and you're one of the activists who's covering the uprising there. Your government is trying to get you, right? You're actually doing a good thing. You're speaking for democracy, you're pointing out human rights abuses, and so if you're not allowed to use a VPN, maybe your government is going to find out who you are. Michael Smith comes back to that and says, well, why don't we do something in between? Why don't we say that you're only allowed to use a VPN if you have a blue check mark next to your name on Twitter, meaning you're already a verified account, right? Anyway, these discussions are endless and complicated. The only thing I can tell you for sure is that the situation that we have right now is untenable. I have spoken personally to people who have a young woman in Washington State in her 20s who was a Sunday school teacher, a Christian girl, who within 3 months was lured by these people and was trying to leave to go to Syria. It was her grandmother who contacted me. People's lives are being destroyed by this. And so I think that at some point something has to be done. And I don't know that I have a solution, but something has to be done because this kind of indoctrination online is not good for anyone.
Thanks. I have one more question now
Sure.
that you've given me that information. Do you see the complications as well, how social media has corrupted our democracy and how influential the global community is now becoming?
Yeah.
And do you have any comments about how to look forward? And I'll let you speak to the crowd.
That's a little bit outside my wheelhouse, since I cover I cover ISIS. Oh, sure. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was getting away from that. I was just saying that's a little bit outside of my beat. I cover ISIS. I don't cover the American political scene, but I do see in the messages that I get from well-meaning people. For instance, after the Las Vegas attack, which, as some of you might know, ISIS claimed, I get people sending me messages every day, well-meaning, not malicious people, who are sending me things like InfoWars, which is a well-known conspiracy site, right? And saying, did you read this, Rukmini? Do you think this might have happened, right? Or sending me somebody's blog and asking me, do you think that this is true? What I'm noticing is a real lack of, I would say, media literacy, right? My institution, the New York Times, which I happen to love, it took me 10 years to be hired there. By the way, 10 years, and I was applying every single year for 10 years before I was hired at the New York Times. It has its flaws, and it has made some enormous journalistic mistakes, including the Iraq War coverage back in 2003. But the difference between an established media organization like the New York Times, like CNN, like the Associated Press, is that there are checks and balances in place. When we make mistakes, we issue a correction. Between me and the publishing of a story are at least 3 editors, right? So there's 3 different people that are looking over what I'm doing and pushing back on me and saying, Rukmini, are you sure that this is right? Are you sure, shouldn't we call somebody else? And what I'm seeing in the world is people just taking stuff off of Facebook and not understanding that that is not a journalistic institution. There is no system in place to catch errors or to catch biases there. Hi.
I hope this is within your wheelbarrow.
Wheelhouse, I think.
We'll find out.
My wheelbarrow too, yeah.
The question I recognize that we haven't defeated ISIS,
Yes.
and the internet issues and the issues you brought up are very clear. However, it strikes me that it was important for us
Absolutely.
to do the
Yeah.
revamping of those 2 cities
Absolutely.
and bring them back into the control of
Absolutely.
Iraq and
Yes.
Syria.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what else we can do to defeat ISIS, please.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. The territorial caliphate, and as I think I said in my talk, I don't at all mean to underplay the great victories that have happened in recent months. The territorial caliphate was crucial to ISIS because it was their haven, and it was through the holding of territory that they were able to make absolutely phenomenal sums of money. I think most people assume that ISIS is being sponsored by some foreign government. They're not. I have actually spent a lot of time in Mosul looking at the financial records that they left behind. This is a group that acted much like any country in the world. They tax people. Every single human being that lived in the Caliphate, and at one point it was 12 million people that were there, had to pay taxes to this group. They taxed every sort of commerce, agriculture, flour mills, bakeries, restaurants, textile mills. And they made millions and millions, quite literally billions of dollars off of this enterprise. So the erasure of the territorial caliphate is, of course, the #1 priority. The question now becomes, how do we police all of these other areas where they are going? So in the time that the Mosul battle started, ISIS took a town in the Philippines called Marawi. Have you guys heard of this? Right? I'd never heard of Marawi, but they took Marawi. And the Duterte government boldly said that they would take it back in a matter of days, weeks. Marawi fell the same day as Raqqa, which was yesterday. Months and months and months later, right? But what it shows is that little cell, was strong enough to hold an entire city for months and months and months. And you have these little cells really all over the world. And the question becomes, how are we going to police all of them? I'm answering your question by saying that I don't have an answer. I don't know how we're going to do that, but what is clear is that if we declare the end of ISIS, which is what politicians want us to do because everybody wants to have a win, right? Of course we want to defeat ISIS. We all agree on that. But if we declare the end of ISIS, I fear we're going to be taking our eye off the ball. Hi, sir.
Hi. Thank you for raising our level of awareness.
Thank you.
You didn't mention, though, whether and to what extent the recruits you described are mercenaries.
Yes, and so one thing that the U.S. has done is they've identified many of these recruiters, and we have seen them being picked off one by one. Okay, Abu Issa al-Amraki was killed in the spring of last year. Several others whose names most of you may not know were also picked off. But what we're seeing is that the skills that they have created are being regenerated. So either they trained other people or they were part of a much bigger pool of people than we knew, because we're now seeing these plots are continuing. Every couple of weeks, there is one plot of this nature in Europe, right? And so we don't quite have a handle on how many of these external, they call them external attack plotters, are around, and how many of them have gone to ground in areas outside of Iraq and Syria, like in Libya and like in Turkey.
But are they getting paid?
Oh, are they getting paid?
Paid.
I'm sorry, I thought you meant marked men as in like
Mercenaries.
targeted.
Yes.
All ISIS members, they consider themselves a state, so all ISIS members have a salary, but it's very small. It's a couple $100.
But isn't it part of the recruitment process to
It's
induce?
not. No,
It is
it's
not.
really not. Money is not what's changing hands here. This is something that people assume might be the case, but there's really no evidence that people are being lured by money, except in the sense of in Iraq and Syria, you'll hear accounts of villagers who were poor and who will say that they joined ISIS to be able to have a small salary, right? But when we're talking about small salary, we're talking about $80 a month, $100 a month, right?
First, I just want to say thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure.
I really
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
My question was, you talked about ISIS using these techniques through the internet, but other loosely connected groups like ISIL and the Boko Haram, do you know if they employ the same tactics?
So ISIS was really the leader in this. When ISIS started doing this, you saw Al-Qaeda trying to up its game. So I suddenly saw the Al-Qaeda guys that I was following in Africa open Twitter accounts. Suddenly I could send them DMs on Twitter. They're all trying to do it at some level, but nobody has been able to do it to the slickness and professionalism that ISIS has managed to pull off.
Thank you.
Sure.
As it turns out, my question is somewhat similar to his, but as you're talking about this remote-controlled terrorism and its spread, do you think that there is a future where we may see the extinction of, for lack of a better term, brick-and-mortar terrorism, that this is someday going to be an issue that can no longer be combated in a sort of city-to-city basis?
I don't understand what you mean by brick and mortar terrorism. Like, you mean like people who are coming from overseas?
Will this someday, do you think, replace entirely sort of the model of terrorism that we're familiar with up to this point?
Well, I don't know for sure, but what we're seeing with ISIS right now is just like in that white paper that I mentioned to you from Al-Qaeda, they're trying to do, it's not like one or the other. They're still trying to infiltrate, fighters back overseas. They keep on getting arrested in Eastern Europe and Turkey, right? So they're still trying that route, but it's not as successful as before. And at the same time, they're doing this, right? And one thing to keep in mind is sometimes I think we give ourselves false hope when we see a stabbing and nobody's killed and only a couple of people are lightly injured, right? That event, in ISIS's eyes, is still a success because their aim is just to create terror, to make us feel unwell in our home environment. Whether it will supplant it completely, it's hard to say, but I think that it seems that more of a multi-pronged approach is what they're going for.
Could you speak into the microphone so the rest of the people?
I'm sorry, every time I look that way, the microphone gets away from me. Yeah. I need to look like this, yeah.
You've mentioned repeatedly that we were expecting things to end sooner. We were expecting Mosul to fall much more quickly, Raqqa to fall much more quickly. And it took much longer.
Yeah.
And the numbers that I'm aware of that have been in ISIL have not been great. We've heard that they're not that many, some thousands, but not a huge amount. And they were up against enormous forces. what is your understanding of why they were able to hold on and why so much destruction was required?
So the numbers in each location might not sound like a lot, a couple thousand per city, right? But the overall numbers of ISIS, I don't think anybody knows the full number, but I've heard everything from up to 100,000 fighters overall. And even now, after all of the territory they've lost, I sent an email to the coalition, and they answered me on Friday, so just a couple days ago. They said that even now, they believe that ISIS has, just in Iraq and Syria, 6,000 to 10,000 fighters, 6,000 to 10,000. And these are people who are willing to, strap on a suicide bomb and kill themselves in this cause. Why are they so fierce? Number one, they've become quite good, at what they're doing. I hate to say this. It's uncomfortable to use the word sophisticated when you're talking about, people that are killing other people in such a savage way. But they have become quite good. In the years that they have held Mosul, one of the innovations that they came up with is ISIS is now able to essentially manufacture many of their own weapons. They're manufacturing their own mortars, they're manufacturing their own rockets. So that means that when you encircle them, they're not going to run out of these things to lob over you because they can make them. We found in the weapons factories that they left behind, we found the labels for some of these mortars and rockets, and they have a date on them showing when they made them. And they were making them in real time. So as the operation was ongoing, they were making their mortars and rockets and continuing to lob them at the coalition. The coalition had thought that just by encircling Mosul, they would essentially snuff them out. The second thing is they don't fight fair. They're using civilians as human shields. And they're using them as human shields in the most grotesque ways that you can imagine. In Western Mosul, we interviewed people who said that ISIS would come into their house. They would literally weld the doors shut, weld them shut, so that the family could not leave. And then they would use that house as a fighting position, right? And the coalition is then in this impossible situation. Do you bomb the house and kill the family that you know is inside? These family members are often communicating with people on the exterior, so you know that they are there, right? I had Iraqi commanders tell me that in civilian neighborhoods, ISIS had gone on the tops of houses and created scarecrows, putting hats on them, putting scarves on them, and putting an RPG on them, or putting an automatic weapon on them, in the hopes of drawing coalition fire. Because they knew that if that building crumbles and kills hundreds of civilians, it'll be a win for them. They can then say, look at how brutal the coalition is, look at what savages they are. So you have an enormous force, the coalition, which is fighting in a traditional way. You have this much smaller force that is fighting in a dirty way, right? And so that imbalance occurs, right? The smaller number then doesn't completely speak to their strength. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation.
My pleasure.
So my question, I'm curious about the ethical questions when people in the field are dealing with the terrorists. So just as you mentioned in your story that the terrorists shoot himself and then call 911 for help. So how would people in charge deal with the terrorists like them?
You mean when they capture them?
I mean, how do they treat them? Do they save them first and then
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me talk about Iraq, because I spent a lot of time there. Look, I've seen both things. I have seen Iraqi military members give bottles of water and food to a captured ISIS member. I have also seen them treat them so roughly. I haven't seen them tortured, but I've seen them treat captives so roughly that I could imagine what would happen when I wasn't there. Because of course, in front of a journalist, they're going to be more restrained. So unfortunately, part of the operation has been tarnished by the very real allegations of torture that have happened on the Iraqi side. When you speak to the Iraqi commanders, and you hear the unbelievable injustices that they suffered at the hands of ISIS. So one particular commander that I spent some time with, General Jabouri, he came from the Jabouri tribe. The The Jabouri tribe was this influential tribe in Mosul, and it just so happened that many of their members were in the military and in the police and in the security force. So when ISIS came in, they made a point to especially target those people. And some of the most horrific videos that ISIS put out were this man's cousins being executed. In one execution video, they take several of his cousins, they put them in a tank, chained to the tank, and they submerge them in water, and they film them as they're drowning underwater. In another video that ISIS put out, they put them inside of a car, they tie them up to parts of the car, and they fire an RPG at the car. The whole thing is filmed. In another video, they put a Jabouri member in front of a tank and rolled the tank on top of him. So my point is, it's very hard for us to imagine the type of savagery that the forces fighting ISIS have faced, right? When a member of your family dies in this horrific way, you want revenge. And so sadly, we are seeing some of that, and that has tainted the effort to do this in a clean way. In the very last day when Mosul was being liberated, so July 9th was when they freed the city. On July 8th and July 7th, I was there, and we weren't allowed into the city. They had completely roped it off, and reporters were not allowed inside. A couple days after the liberation of the city, a video emerged, and it was a video of Iraqi troops that had taken ISIS members. They had their hands tied behind their back, and they were being pushed off of a very tall building and then shot at the bottom of the building. So these things are happening, you know?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Terrorism has been around forever.
Yes.
And at the end of your presentation, you mentioned that social media and the internet are tools used by ISIS. So I'm just wondering, do you think they would have had such an effective campaign and propaganda program without the internet? Or, global geopolitics in the last 10 years, would they have been as successful without the internet?
I don't think ISIS would be what it is today without Twitter, Telegram, and these other social media engines. Without them, I think they would have been what Al-Qaeda remains today, which is, still a threat. They still carry out attacks here and there in the Middle East and in Africa, but as far as attacks on our soil, we haven't seen something in a long while. ISIS was able to essentially recruit millennials, recruit digital natives. And on the one hand, they're a very top-down organization. They're very hierarchical, and they're real micromanagers. But on the other hand, they were pretty creative in allowing people to do this kind of thing, This was just made by some ISIS supporter, not a famous member, right? And they've created this echo chamber online that is so potent. When you speak to the people that have been radicalized by them, once they enter this echo chamber, they don't believe anything else. They can read a New York Times article and they think that's all lies, because ISIS has taught them that every media other than their own is the kufar media, the infidel media. So I don't think that ISIS would be where it is today without social media. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation and the
My
work
pleasure.
you do. My question is, I'm interested in your opinion on whether you think drone strikes are a net positive or negative in the war on terror. Just your thoughts.
Drone strikes are a really hard one. It's undeniable that drone strikes have killed civilians, many civilians. And we know that when those incidents happen in those communities, that becomes a cause, that becomes an enormous grievance and an enormous reason for hating the United States. At the same time, we are in a landscape, in a political landscape, where I don't think America has, the American people I don't think have the stomach to send large numbers of troops back to Iraq or Syria, which is what you would need to do if you're not allowed to use the air, right? So by using drones, we are able to save American lives, and we are able to target the leadership of these groups, and a lot of leaders have been killed in drone strikes. So many of the top leaders of Al-Qaeda in recent years, numerous members of ISIS. So it's a trade-off.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more? Okay.
Thank you for enduring all this.
It's my pleasure.
Historically, belligerent aims with a global view have been defeated by a great network of allies working together from different parts of the world. I wonder what your feeling is about that. We're talking mostly from our U.S. perspective tonight, but do you have a feeling that other nations, I'm thinking of, feel the threat, long-term threat, African nations, Middle Eastern nations? Do they feel the threat that you're presenting, and are they coming to terms with it?
Well, I can speak from the areas where I've been, right? And of course, it's these countries that have been the most victimized by this group. Boko Haram has run rampant all over northern Nigeria, parts of Cameroon, parts of Chad, right? Hundreds of girls have been kidnapped and enslaved by them. Countless villages have been burned to the ground, and the death toll is enormous. In Africa, it's a coalition of countries that have come together to fight. Chad, Nigeria, other nations. They're getting some military guidance from the United States, from France, but they seem to be doing the dirty work themselves. And now in Iraq and Syria, I was pretty skeptical of what seemed to be the Obama doctrine on ISIS, which is we're not going to send troops back, and the local groups, the local partners need to figure out how to do it themselves. The Iraqi military that up and ran when ISIS took Mosul, they're the ones that are going to have to come back and take it. The downside to that is how long it took. It took 3 years to mount the effort, but I was with them when they were doing it, and you see them coming into their own and owning this problem. It's the military commanders who are losing their men, in this fight, that are now going to do everything possible to make sure that ISIS doesn't come back because they lost their men in this fight, right? So there might be something to that, and hopefully, I don't know, but hopefully that means that there will be some capacity in these areas to keep ISIS at bay. Thank you, sir.
Hi.
Last but not least.
So when the Taliban first entered Afghanistan, they were seen as like a saving grace. They wanted to impose strict Sharia law, like you said, ISIS does.
Yeah.
So what comparison do you see with ISIS and other terrorist groups like the Taliban?
Very similar. So when ISIS first took Mosul, there were plenty of people that came out into the streets to cheer them. Things changed as soon as they started, crucifying people, beheading people, etc. When Al-Qaeda took Timbuktu in northern Mali, which they held for almost a year, people I interviewed, who I went to see after the city was liberated, said that they were initially grateful that there was security. There wasn't security before, right? People were getting robbed, women were being raped, and so at least this group came in and there was security. Well, then bad things started happening. But that seems to be a constant, where they use whatever vacuum is there, whatever lack of governance is there, they come in and they fix that little problem. And at least in the initial stages, they seem to have some support from the local population, which then erodes over time. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Before we close the program, let me invite you to join us for some conversation and good cheer in the lobby as we have a reception. And I'd like to invite you to mark your calendars for November 16th, when Dennis Whittle, who's the founder of Global Giving, will be here to speak in the third of this series during this semester. Please join me in thanking once again Rukmini Callimachi.